Welcome to Unit 8, Topic 8.4. Today we're talking about the spread of communism after 1900. Let's take it away. So, today we're going to examine the spread of communism into China, while also practicing how to explain the limits of a primary source document. So we're going to soak the document with the focus on the limits, okay? So 8.4, spread of communism after 1900. The focus is on economics, economic systems of Chinese communism. So focus on that. Our learning objective is explain the causes and consequences of China's adoption of communism over time. Let's look at the more specific historical developments. So as a result of the internal tension and external Japanese aggression, Chinese communists seized power in China. Okay, now these changes in China eventually led to the Communist Revolution. So in Communist China, the government controlled the national economy, okay, through these two major political and historical developments called the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, okay, where they often implemented repressive policies with negative repercussions for the population, millions and millions of people. All right, so now let's move along. We're talking about the leader of Communist China, Mao Zedong, and his implementation of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, two historical developments you need to know for topic 8.4. Who is Mao Zedong? Well, he was a Chinese military and political leader who led the Communist Party of China. The victory against the Kuomintang in the Chinese Civil War against Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, okay? So the leader of the People's Republic of China, from its establishment in 1949 all the way until his death in 1976. Keep in mind the dates. Well, Mao Zedong was arguably regarded as one of the most important figures in modern world history because of the impact he had on this populated Chinese society, one of the largest populations in the world, right? However, many of his programs, such as the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, look, they're blamed from within and outside of China for causing severe damage to the culture, society, the economy, and the foreign relations of China, as well as the probable death toll in the tens of millions, all right? So when looking at the leadership of China, we're talking about the People's Republic of China. 1949, it was established by Mao Zedong. The Communist Party assumed control of all the media in the country, and they used it to promote Mao, right, as the supreme leader of the party through propaganda posters, images, video, right? Okay, and any form of communication. So the Chinese people were exhorted and they devoted themselves to build and strengthen their country to an extent, and we're going to figure that out, right? So one of his first political campaigns after founding the People's Republic, he wanted two major changes. He wanted land reform and the suppression of counter-revolutionaries, which centered on mass executions, often before organized crowds. So Mao himself, he even admitted this, that a total of around 700,000 people were executed from 1949 to 1953. So now you start to listen to this man takes power, Communist China. What is policies similar to? Who are his policies similar to? What does this sound like? Oh, wow, this sounds like the Soviet Union all over again here, these policies and the consequences of these policies, right? All right, well, here we go, Mao and Stalin. So following the consolidation of power, he launched his first 5-year plan, 1953 to 58. And they wanted to end Chinese dependence on agriculture and farming. In order to become a world power, they wanted to industrialize. And Stalin offered the USSR's assistance, right? So they industrialized, and they eventually, to the point where they were beginning to produce enough capital, China no longer needed the USSR's support, and Mao started to implement policies that were more specifically pertained to Chinese economy and culture. What is the first one? The Great Leap Forward. So the success of industrialization in that first 5-year plan led to the second 5-year plan called the Great Leap Forward in 1958. Well, this is where land was taken primarily from rich landlords and given to the poor peasants. Now think about the camaraderie and the support millions of peasants would give to the Communist Party and Mao because of these actions that were taken. Also, large-scale industrialization projects were undertaken to further industrialize. So, Mao's attempt to modernize China's economy so that by his plan was about 1988, China would have an economy that rivaled America, right? We were like the gold standard here, right? So two primary tasks that he felt that they should target was industry and agriculture. And boy, did he attempt to do this in their own way. So the Great Leap Forward had planned to develop agriculture and industry. And Mao believed that industry could only prosper if the workforce was well fed. Now, this is in contrast, a little different than Stalin and his 5-year plans and collectivization, right? Where Stalin let a large portion of his rural population starve to death, along with the foreign Ukrainian population that supported the Soviets there with the Great Ukrainian Famine. Well, Mao does something a little bit different, or at least he attempts to, by trying to implement this policy where he reformed much of rural China into a series of communes, community land. People in a commune gave up their ownership of literally everything, tools, animals, etc. It was everything owned by the commune. So look, in practicality, there were more negative effects here of this Great Leap Forward in these communes. What really happened? Millions starved to death in what is thought to be one of the largest famines in human history. So according to government statistics, there are about 15 million deaths between 1959 and 1962. All right, so now people are starting to frown on Mao, but you really can't say that in public or you would disappear, right? But he knows that political opposition is growing, so he implements the Cultural Revolution. This is another big historical development in China. Facing the prospect of losing his place on the political stage, here he goes. Mao responds, launching the Cultural Revolution in 1966. And what was the main focus? To get rid of, to abolish what they call the four olds, the old customs of China, the old culture, the old habits, and the old ideas. In other words, anybody that was in political opposition of Mao would now disappear. So how did he do this? Well, he mobilized a certain demographic of the Chinese communist population, and he turned them into what he called the Red Guard. Now, the Red Guard's role in the Cultural Revolution, well, they traveled throughout China. They went to schools, universities, institutions, spreading the teachings of Mao. They were like this big group, and you could not turn them away. You cannot deny them. They were a powerful, influential force in communist Chinese society. Let's perform a little image analysis now. I'm going to show you the following propaganda posters. And what I'm going to ask you to do is try to determine what similarities can you find in the following propaganda posters that reflect the successful mobilization of the Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution. So what in these images is similar between all of them that reflect the success of the Red Guard during this Cultural Revolution? So let's take a look, and what I'm going to do is slowly click and leave this for about 5 or 6 seconds and move on to the next image. What I want you to look is detailed. Look at the details of the images. Make sure you look at facial expressions, posture, the environment around the individuals themselves. And you see things start to pop up that are very similar. And there's a couple of different little developments in here, little techniques of propaganda that are very similar. All right, I'm going to keep moving back and forth between the images, and you keep your eyes on the image. Let's hear from some of you. So Leah, what is one similarity in all of these images?
They're all happy and they all have a lot of food and look prosperous.
Leah, what piece of evidence led you to believe they all looked happy?
They're smiling.
They're all smiling. Look at the facial expressions here. Smiling, or look on the right-hand side right there. this proud look. Now, what else, especially for the images where you can see their faces clearly, what else can you say, like they're looking, like what else can you say about the look? Kendall, what do you think? Okay, go ahead, Leah, finish.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, you want me to continue?
Yeah.
They're looking
What can you say about the look?
Diagonal, like to the future, kind of looks like.
Leah, you hit the nail on the head. Excellent. They're looking toward the future. They're looking toward the future. Kendall, can you find another similarity in most or all of these images? Characters, which would denote a very similar image, even though we don't know exactly what the message is. But you're right, that book, right? That book, can anybody make an inference on what is inside that book? It is the little red book. And you could say similar to, in a way, like Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, that book that was looked at as their social, economic, political, spiritual guidance. And what's in that book is law, right? All right. There's something else in most of these images that's very similar. So I'll give you a little clue. Look at these images. What seems to be similar about the demographic here? And there's one more thing that seems to be similar. They're all young. They're all, for the most part, look, the youth, they're all young for the most part. All right? Take a look. Similarities that reflect successful mobilization of the Red Guard during a cultural revolution. The people in all of the images reflect the youth of China. Number two, the people in all of those images have positive facial expressions of hope as they look to the future. Look at that, Leah. And three, the people in all of the images show support toward Mao Zedong's communist China by actively participating in the Cultural Revolution. All right? So that is a reflection of the mobilization of the Red Guard. So look, the Red Guard's role in the Cultural Revolution also, to reiterate, attack the four olds, right? And also they spread around. So Red Guards in Beijing and elsewhere in China, they take into the streets from their schools. Some committed violent acts in the name of this cultural revolution, and the violence over time grew. So many religious buildings, temples, churches, mosques, cemeteries were closed down and sometimes looted and destroyed. Sources of power and influence were done away with. So in August and September, about 1,772 people were murdered in Beijing alone. Shanghai, in the following September, 704 suicides, 534 deaths related to the Cultural Revolution. All right, so you can see this. Well, the end of the Cultural Revolution was symbolic. In October 1968, Liu Shaoqi was expelled from the party as a scapegoat. And this is generally seen by historians as the end of the Cultural Revolution. It's like Mao said, if we get rid of this one troublemaker, all of our problems are solved, right? So he witnessed the removal of a potential rival in the party. It was good for him. Therefore, he saw no need for a cultural revolution to continue. And he continued to rule for almost 10 more years after this, okay? So what were the ultimate effects of the Cultural Revolution? Many Chinese lost their jobs as a result of the Great Cultural Revolution. Education, it came to a halt across the country. Talents were suppressed. They were exiled to manual labor in the fields with the communes. Many other skilled professionals were either persecuted or executed, leaving behind vast numbers of poorly educated people, ill-equipped for the 20th century. You can make a lot of assertions how far-reaching this is, right? Foreign embassies were attacked by the Red Guards. The British embassy was even burned down completely. My goodness, think about the point of view of foreign countries, what they would think about the Cultural Revolution, Mao, and Communist China. Now let's do some practice, all right? Start thinking about the limitations of the document, right? As your historians, you got to look past bias and you really want to look at the limitations of the document, the value of what perspective it shows. By knowing the greater context around that document, which we just reviewed, you would be able to say, yeah, this document supports this, but we also know that there are other points of views or other historical developments that are not mentioned in this document that show it has limits. Here we go, people. Analyze the relationship between Chinese peasants and the Chinese Communist Party between 1925 and 1950. So now, immediately, when you see two dates, that's the biggest clue, change in continuity over time. So I would immediately run through the 7 documents and look at the dates. You might see 4 dates that are closer to 1925. They'll probably be between like 1925, 1935. And then you'll see maybe 3 documents that are closer to 1950. And you go, boom, there it is. Change in continuity. Now I know what to do. I already know how to group the documents before I even read them because I read the dates. Okay? Sometimes it's more complex than that, but the second that you see 2 dates, always go and look at the dates of all the documents first. And it might save you a lot of time trying to figure out how to group the documents. All right, everybody. Here's our prompt analysis. We just went over it, and you can see it matches up everything we said. Okay, when you see 2 dates, change continuity over time. Here we go. Take a look at the document. Everybody climb in. I'm going to give you 5, well, till 2:45. About 6 minutes. Go. Is I'm just going to go over it, and what you want to do is compare yours to this one. Okay? So, what is the subject? Mao Zedong declares the intentions of the peasant class of China to fight tyranny. Okay? So he's declaring the intentions of the peasant class, right? He's declaring what the peasants want, what they're going to do. He's declaring this, right? Now, why would he do that? Well, the purpose, why would he do that? To persuade members of the peasant class to join this movement. He's trying to build an army of support. What is his point of view? Well, it's understandable why Mao Zedong wants to do that, because he's the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. He wants to promote discontent of the peasant class in order to recruit people to his movement. That's his point of view. Okay? Now, this is change in continuity over time as the style. Why? Here's what you have to do with the documents. Because in 1927, if you look on the bottom right, source, Mao Zedong, rising leader of China Communist Party, written report on the peasant movement in central China in 1927. Was Mao Zedong the leader of communist China in 1927? No, that didn't happen until 1949. So what's going on in 1927? Well, this is changing continuity over time because this document fits. Look, it's at 1927, 2 years after 1925. So this is at the beginning. So your 2 paragraphs would be what's going on at the beginning of the Chinese Communist Revolution and what's going on toward like the end of it, but they give you 1950. So 1950 is when he first takes over. So it's like what went on before that to the point where he takes over. Well, what was going on before that? Well, 1927 was right before the Civil War between Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. There was a big civil war that would determine who takes over China between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong's communists. So by 1950, communist-run China purged 700,000 political opponents. So in 1927, Mao Zedong was just recruiting people to support the communist movement. That's why he's saying what he's saying. By 1950, all the bad stuff starts to happen with the purging and then the communes and the Cultural Revolution, right? So in the beginning, this is when he gets a lot of support because he's making claims and promises. So what's the limitation on this document? Well, this is only a communist point of view of China at this time. It doesn't directly reflect the views of the peasant class or Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party. So if you're just a poor Chinese family and you haven't made a decision who you want to support, this doesn't reflect their point of view. This only reflects the communist leadership point of view. All right? And it doesn't reflect the other side that's against the communists, which is the Chinese nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek. So it only gives you a limited point of view, this document. Okay? When you get change in continuity over time, you have to look at the dates and what's going on. So this is before he takes power. It's where he's making promises and trying to gather a movement of followers to support him. By 1950, so what you would see in a 7-document DBQ, you would see other documents of maybe a chart of like death count of like purged political opponents. Or do you see another document of like murders or numbers of people who disappeared? Or you would see a document right around 1950 of like somebody that previously believed in the Communist Party, now like part of their families disappeared and they don't know where they are, or they haven't eaten in a long time. And it's like, oh, those are the negatives that are happening by 1950. So 1925 was all positive, build the movement. By 1950, people started to feel like the effects here, okay? So again, you're saying, well, Mr. D, you're telling me it's cause and effect. Well, that could be the complexity inside of this. But when you see dates, it's change of continuity. So at the beginning of the period, you see a document that's all about hope and all about change. And the reason I'm saying this is I'm going to show you another document. So there's not enough time for you to run through it. So I want to run through it for you. So stick with me and I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to show you another document now. Document 2, right? Take a look at this. Boom, let's look at the dates first, change of continuity. This was written 1936. All right, so we're not near 1950 yet. 1936, 1925, this is about the revolution, the communists taking over, promises, positive change, looking forward toward the future with hope, right, Leah, from those propaganda posters. And let's see what this is. A conversation between a teenage peasant, the youth, and his grandfather, the old ways, the old traditions, right? From an area controlled by Chinese communists, recounted by Edgar Snow. Who's that? A United States journalist in 1936. Now you're looking at point of view too, right? Let's see what the kid says. It's in quotes, so you know it's the kid's words. So it's not an interpretation by this journalist. Grandfather, you call villages joining the Poor People's League, voting for communists, having their sons join communist armies or daughters enroll in schools crimes? They are patriotic acts, grandfather, right? Did we have a free school before? Did we ever get news of the world before the communists brought us radios? Who told us what the world would be like? You say the cooperative has no cloth, but did we even have a cooperative before? Like the communes. How about your farm? Wasn't there a big mortgage on it to the landlord Wang? My sister starved to death 3 years ago, but haven't we had plenty to eat since the communists came? You say it's bitter, but isn't it bitter for us young communist vanguards when we learn to use a rifle and fight traitors in Japan? So it's like this kid is pushing forward all the positives that have happened and are to come. It's only 1936, right? By 1950 is when all the oppressive policies started to take place. So this document, by date, corroborates with this document. Look at all the positivity. Now you get the perspective of Mao Zedong and his communist movement from the eyes of the leader, right? Now you look at document 2, you get the point of view from a young boy who supports this movement. You get the point of view of an older grandfather who was around before Mao Zedong and opposes the movement. And you get the point of view of the American journalist who wants to inform the American public that there's actually opposition inside China between the youth and the elderly population over these communist policies. So now when we look at all this, so now we get all these point of views from this. So Mr. D, you group them together. They're both in the first paragraph when everything was good. And I guarantee the rest of the DBQ would be closer to 1950, where things start to be implemented and things start to go wrong and you see more evidence of oppression instead of hope and looking toward the future. So it's an American journalist. The subject, Edgar Snow, provides differing perspectives on communist China between a young boy and his old grandfather. Why? To inform the American audience, you know, the readers of this newspaper, of the differences in political beliefs that exist in communist China between young and old. What's the point of view? It's an American journalist provides the words, and that's why I say the words of a young communist, the contrast with the views of his older grandfather. Now, this is changing continuity over time because 1936 is still the beginning of the communist movement before Mao implemented political policies that resulted in death and suffering. What's a limitation here? Well, this is just one conversation between one Chinese communist youth and his one older grandfather, which needs further corroboration to improve credibility and reliability. So we don't know how many other people in 1936 agree with this little boy or disagree with his grandfather. We would need other documents, right? So what should you walk away with? Well, Chiang Kai-shek became a nationalist leader in the 1920s. He led several purges of communists in China. Then Mao Zedong began growing the Chinese Communist Party. The peasant farmers were attracted to his ideas of land distribution, to take the land from the rich and give it to the poor. And, you know, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao's forces, they fought a bloody civil war from 1930 to 1949, only stopping to fight Japan during World War II. But his victory was a huge blow to actually the American idea of containment. Remember that one? So that's why Americans supported Chiang Kai-shek. They did not want Mao Zedong to take over and spread communism. But once Mao comes to power, he began to follow the Stalin model, right? And that was obvious, and began a series of 5-year plans to rebuild industry and farming. And he also began the Great Leap Forward in 1958. And the Great Leap Forward started well with a large increase in farming and manufacturing output. But then the casualties, the suffering, right? Life became worse for the average worker, and famine quickly spread through China, along with persecution and death with the Cultural Revolution. Look, people, when you are looking at a prompt and you see 2 dates and or documents that you can group according to the beginning of that time period with the 2 dates and the end of the time period with the 2 dates, those are the major clues that reveal the style of essay is change and continuity over time. I really, really, really hope this helps.